So welcome to the session on More Than Race, Engaging Place, Class, and Gender with Dr. Krista Comer. Excuse me, it's been a long day. In the English department here at Rice University. Dr. Comer is an American Studies scholar of the contemporary period with interests in problems of space, place, and their theorization. Her books include Landscapes of the New West, Gender and Genre in Contemporary Women's Writing, and Surfer Girls in the New World Order. I'm actually particularly eager to look at that one. She has published essays about critical regionalism and gender, questions of history and literature and critical theory, civil rights literatures and post-civil rights political imaginations, feminist environmentalism, and issues of youth politics and girls' communities under neoliberalism. So in other words, her interests are wide-ranging, but deeply germane to the things that we are discussing today. So without further ado, Frank.
Thank you for coming. I know it's been a full day. It's been such a remarkable day to look at. Particularly this morning, I think just the kind of options for how to go after the topics and the more dynamic teaching modes are, I think I already do a number of things that are in that direction, but the degree to which, Sam and Lori showed us both how they do it and their direction for how we might do it in ways that would be good for us. I find that really, there's a lot of opening that's created. So, I took a slightly different tack than a lot of the other presentations. I have more prepared remarks, and partly I did because that's just when I started thinking about the questions, which were on the website, the questions of the symposium, that was my response to them. So I think I'll just give you some of my prepared remarks. They're not overly long or anything, but it may make you work a little harder than thinking going to it the last one. And I hope not too hard. When I was developing this response, what finally came to me was that my response to the questions took the shape for me of what I think would be a great class and different than the classes I already teach. And I wanted to just show you some of the classes I teach so you have a sense of the ways that I work on race. And also it's the way that gender and class and place issues are moving through it. So the response I had was just to think about a class that would be different than that, and that would be kind of more broad around notions of comparative racialization and conceptualizing race for the 21st century. So I'm going to say a few things about that. So I have two large observations to begin through, and these both go to the point that it seems to me in the last 10 or 15 years it has gotten harder to teach materials in race. I experience it that way, not because of the students, but because of the general climate. And I wanted to say a few things about that. The reasons are complicated. There's not like a single reason why. But it seems important to try to figure out some of the reasons, because if we were to think about how we could both be clear ourselves but also train students in ways that would allow them to intervene effectively in conversations about very contemporary race affairs, I think it's helpful to have some sense of why we've arrived at this point. So the first thing is I just sort of said, I don't find students at Rice to be any more apathetic or disinterested than any other person of a certain age at this moment in U.S. history. I think they're, so I don't find them to be unwilling. They don't complain that race discussions are depressing. In my experience, they just don't know how to think about race systematically. And there doesn't seem to be a larger institutional commitment. And so there isn't the impression they should know how to think about this, or that it's even possible to know how to think about it. Really, I think that they just, I think like a lot of people, everybody lives in fear of being called racist. And so that just makes you anxious and it makes you not want to take risks. And I think students are, they evidence that. I mean, I have had some reluctance in my graduate seminars, which was surprising to me, actually, where conversations get sabotaged or they get kind of distracted. But I haven't had it with undergrads, which tells me that the sources of it are not coming from undergrads. all. So what are resources? One term that comes to mind for me, and I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here, but I wanted to make a list because it seemed kind of too detailed for the end of the day. But this was generally neoliberalism. I'm probably speak to the choir, but I wanted to raise it as the large context for thinking about race. I'm thinking, when I say neoliberalism, that's a kind of shorthand of this new world of markets, heavy emphasis on markets, new modes of governance, new definitions of individualism, what a lot of people call hyper-individualism, and the softening of trade barriers. And to me, neoliberalism diagnoses some of the changes that govern the present moment and make race thinking seem unnecessary. In the Western world, the idea is widespread, as we all know, that we live in a post-racial, post-feminist society. So too is the idea that if you have some kind of a structural problem, i.e. you experience racism or sexism or some other ism, that you basically didn't effectively figure out, especially this is true I think for undergraduates, you didn't plan properly. you didn't make the right choices. I think that discourse is really out there for young people. So I think that the changed political climate, the new post-civil rights political climate that we've been in the U.S. since really Reagan and deregulation, but especially that we can feel differently since 9/11, I think these pose obvious challenges, right? The second large observation, which I think is less obvious, but it's linked to the new social order and the decline in universities on the emphasis of diversity, is the way that critical modes of thought have responded to globalization, which is to say, in some very large way, everything in terms of our thinking has gone transnational. So whether we do hemispheric studies, whether we talk about post-national studies, whether we rely on world systems theory, or we talk about migrations and diaspora, in some way it's put our analyses into motion, and in a way I think that's made it hard to control, in a way that we were better able to control if you're focusing on the U.S. nation state sort of proper to control for domestic race issues in particular. So in this kind of a wide spectrum context, I just think that race studies as we used to know it has gotten more diffused, and in some ways it's even kind of passé to try to just work only on domestic issues. I think a lot of us would think our colleagues might say to us, well, what are you doing new? What's new? And I wonder, like in presses like this book I just published with Duke, is Duke going to pick up a book that's on only domestic issues? I mean, you would have to have an angle. That's just not the way things are working now. These transnational tendencies have also, we see them a lot in institutional priorities, the way that institutions have, in order to remain competitive among their educational rivals, they now increasingly collaborate with institutional partners. Rice does this. I'm not singling out Rice for any kind of particular negative attention. Everybody does it. In our case, our particular partners in the V2C, right, the vision for the second century, are Brazil, China, and Mexico. And I think we can see in that a kind of strategic targeting of up-and-coming players in the new economies in China and Brazil, and ongoing need here in this part of the world to have Mexico being close at hand. Part of the ways that we've been growing the student body recently, which has been one of the charges of the V2C, is through international study. I mean, it brings new students, it brings a new kind of diversity. The symposium talks about the complications of that kind of diversity for race studies, and it brings new revenue streams. And the kind of major that has more typically been able to be forwarded in this context is one like the Latin American Studies major, although I'm so pleased that Jennifer Bratter announced this morning that there's going to be a program in the study of race, ethnicity, and culture. This to me is tremendous good news, so that's great. But in terms of a vision of the university as a site of social accountability, or some place where we might imagine an institutional commitment, could be part of the social or the institutional charter. Universities aren't taking diversity issues now in the way we understood them to be defined in the civil rights period. They are taking that as part of their charge. So again, domestic race issues have been kind of quieted. Two other things I think are worth mentioning. One is the rise in or what I think of as a return to disciplinarity, to disciplinary practices and a value of disciplinary knowledge. One is a return to that. We've had, when you said my interests were very broad, like my next line is we've had enough kitchen sink cultural studies. That's what I often hear, and I know. I hear this a certain way because I'm one of these kind of kitchen sink cultural studies thinkers. Of course, interdisciplinary is a value. Interdisciplinary is a value in academic life, but not really. Not really. The place you see it the most is, we don't support it in terms of promotion, places where it would really show an institutional commitment. So it sounds good, everybody talks that way, but by and large, people come back to disciplinary knowledges. Even in fields like American studies or women's studies, which were founded across disciplines and which took as their kind of centering purposes particular objects of study, those have gone the way of an increasing disciplinarity. And I have to say I don't find that for myself as someone who's trained in different directions. I think actually I'm learning a lot from it. I think it's probably time to rein certain things back. There's certain kinds of sloppinesses that aren't probably useful. But I think the way this impacts race studies is that American studies and women's studies, or study women, gender, sexuality, have been homes for race studies. And to the degree that each of them has a long time ago really moved on from centering themselves around identity formations or identity projects, I think it has changed the various homes that we might find for race studies. So that's, I think, contributes not to the delegitimation of race, but to the complexity now of thinking about how we want to talk about race, how we want to theorize it, what it is when we're teaching it, and so on. I do think that there is a kind of condescension, I feel, actually among some of my colleagues, that to teach race studies is to teach a kind of simple identity politics. And so I think in some ways there's a misunderstanding of what race studies is about. I think maybe 15 years ago that might have been truer, and I look at my own notes in my various texts I teach, and sometimes I'm like, they were right, actually. I was teaching literature as a form of sociology. I was teaching literature as a form of history. I think that criticism has some merit, and so it's been interesting to think through what it matters, what it means to do that differently, what it is you're teaching, and my colleague Rosemary Hennessy and I were talking about this morning, what it is you're teaching people in terms of critical reading skills, for instance, when you do literary study, that people are returning to this kind of conversation. So I think that that's another reason that race studies has been somewhat complicated, at least in literary study. Alex Bird said earlier today that in history, there's no way you could not do race and be taken seriously as an intellectual. And I don't think that's really untrue in literary study. And yet I do think that there is a kind of hierarchy of what constitutes elite knowledge. And I don't know that race studies is there. I think you have to walk that path in a pretty sophisticated way. And particularly as a white scholar, I think it's, I was thinking this morning, how would this talk be different if I began with a different kind of disclosure about my own whiteness? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's very interesting, in my case, to be married to a person of color and to have 2 children, interracial children, and in some ways to live with racism, not directed at me, but in my family for 20 years, and to pursue a certain kind of intellectual and political project, but also to be, there's a way that I think people would condescend to me. They would never condescend to people of color in race studies. They'd be too scared, actually. But with me, I can take some of what people actually are thinking about their other colleagues, but they wouldn't really like show. So anyway, I've never said that kind of thing in public before, but I was just thinking this morning, like, how does it change things to have a different kind of discussion? Okay, so I guess the other thing I wanted to say just at the end of the list is that, race studies has always been about more than identity politics. And one of the ways I think for myself that I've become a different kind of thinker is actually not because of certain changes in literary studies, but really because of certain seasonings in people that one reads. If you do race studies, like Derek Walcott, for instance, or Fanon, or Edward Glisson, or people who I think have come into the conversation sort of late in the game. So in some ways, race studies has just gotten a lot better. We've gotten smarter, methodologies are more varied, and all of this I think has to do with a general maturation of the project, the knowledge project. So I guess, the title of my talk, More Than Race, I think we've always known that, more or less, that there's more than race in the category. Race, gender is the obvious one. What I wanted to think about some with you, Sam Richards in his TED Talk, I don't know if you guys looked at that, but obviously empire, religion, we could make a huge list. But what I wanted to think, so that's basically part one, the talk, the part that's kind of more meta. But I wanted to think now towards the application in part two, thinking mainly through issues of place, because I think place is a strategic place, right now to do some work with race, because place, this is not a great list because it's kind of quick, and I'm sure I made mistakes and citations, and I'm thinking of Alex Bird, who unfortunately isn't here. He always checks footnotes, so I was thinking about that as I put it up there, but I think at this moment, the place is really an interesting way to go after the concept of race, because it does certain things that transnational analyses don't always get right, which is it locates itself someplace. If you are working on some specific place or some notion of the regional or the local, and by that I feel obliged to say not some kind of parochial localism, but a critical local, a critical geography, a geography that reckons with its borders, that is smart about its borders, and that doesn't take for granted there's some kind of an insider identity or something like that. I think if we're smart about using place, we can use place or use the local or the critical local or the critically regional to think about areas that aren't getting addressed sufficiently in some of the bigger analytic gestures. And so that's what I've been working on lately. I'm not going to really go into that. I've written a book on surfing that's in that vein. But what I thought I would do to try to move us toward a discussion about place was just to say a few things about, well, the first thing was about the talk. I love that, having the talk. Because it invokes for us the talk that parents are supposed to have with their children about sex, right? Having the talk. That invariably goes badly. Whether you give too much information, you don't give enough, you give the wrong thing, you omit the correct thing. And so I was thinking that, I'm sure this is true for all of us, but I just wanted to say that, there's not a conversation. There's not one conversation. There's like a continuing and ongoing conversation for me, and it's not a goal to do something different. I can't see how we would have a single conversation on any of the topics that we cover, whether it's the fiction of race, or race supposedly as biology, or race as lived experience, or race as history, or race as language, or however we want to cut it. I mean, this is just going to take, just the way I think about it actually is teaching really sophisticated novels. I mean, you just have to come back to them, and you come back, and you come back, and you come back. And so I think that's one thing that I try to narrate for students as a practice, that we are sharing, that we value, that we want to embrace, that they should then take as a model to have in other contexts where race comes up, that there shouldn't be some different expectation of what it's going to mean to talk about race, that they're going to figure it out over dinner. I mean, that's just, I think students might sometimes think something like that. So it's helpful to, I think one of the things that Sam said this morning that was really useful to me is the need for leadership, the need for there to be leadership in these kind of conversations, because then I think, at least at RISE, students can model whatever they see. They model in a minute. They just are on to it, they model it, and then they start, like it's this notion of horizontal leadership. They start doing it with other students, and I think that could be very effective here and more generally. What else? I want to say a few things about my youth studies class and the way that some of the practices in my youth studies class have been, I think, effectively translatable into all the conversations I have about race. And I think as a general thing to say, I always tell students that they should come to class no matter what. Whether they're prepared or not, whether they're late or not, whether they're wearing their pajamas or not. The only thing I ask students not to do is I don't want them to come to class high. And I actually ask them not to do that because in youth studies, it seems sometimes to be on the table as a possibility, and that's not cool. I don't want them to come to class high, and I don't want them to think I think it's cool for them to bring beer or something like that. This doesn't work for me. That's not going to work. But I mean, in general, this business of people coming to class and always coming to class, it's a version, I think, of what Sam was saying. My thought is that the more stressed out students are, if they always come to class, there's some hope of them plugging into the class and plugging into you as an adult resource and staying the course of their difficult lives when things get really stressful. And then if they keep coming to class, then they keep having a conversation, right? And they have a conversation, and they continue the conversation even when it gets hard. And it will obviously get hard probably sooner than later in some of the discussions that we're likely to have. The other thing that I do a lot is I try to make, and it's always a complicated thing I think to do as a female faculty, but I try to call into question my own authority. And in the youth studies class, I do that as a way to not be the adult who's in charge, who's the expert, which in a youth studies class, that isn't exactly the way that students will feel like they own the class and that it's about them and that they get to weigh in with authority on issues of youth. So that, and we talk a lot about that, and we read stuff about that. But I think that general willingness on my part to undercut my own authority or to make fun of myself or to be kind of goofy or to make mistakes or to call attention to when I make mistakes, all of these things are, I mean, I do this a fair amount. I ask students if we're having fun, even like when we're totally not having fun. I think all of those things like just create a sense of, they just lighten the moment. And so that environment issue for me in class, generally, it goes pretty well. And I mean, I have like, some of my friends are just, they're appalled that I do this kind of thing. And, but I will say I get like 80 to 90% attendance pretty much all the time. So I think it's okay that it works for students. So I guess I would, in terms of place issues, moving there, it's important to have and I work in the American West a lot, it's important to have the environment right, because one of the things that you work on in the West is genocide. You're going to work a lot on genocide. And that's not a kind of topic that students have any ability right now to deal with. Like it's really, certain race topics are completely they don't exist, and that's one of them. So I thought I would say a few things just about the text Housemaid of Dawn, which I've taught a couple of times recently by Enscott Mamate in Kiowa. And it's been really interesting. Does anybody know the text? You know the text, okay. So it's been interesting to teach that text because it's, we stop at 5:15, is that right?
I would give it to about 5:18 since we
Okay, so
started
I'll
a
stop
little
at
bit
2
late.
minutes, I'll stop.
But be
So-
organic.
Okay, so what, like students can't understand, or the conversation that's useful to have is that the text opens and this young man stumbles off of a bus, he's drunk, his grandfather's come to pick him up, but he's young, and he throws up on his grandpa. And like students are like, they're just, it's a crushing opening scene, it's terrible. And students are outraged, they're like, I don't want to read this text. This guy is so screwed up. Like, why would I even invest in trying to figure this out? He's a jerk. And so it's been really interesting to try to unpack that. I thought for us, there's a million examples, but I thought that would be an interesting one because it's a text where you have Indians speak Spanish. There's all this nature representation, so there's all these blue-eyed Indians. There's a lot of urban space in the text devoted to urban life, plus reservation life. So all of these things, as you can imagine, are really interesting places to unpack around race. The other thing that's interesting in terms of place issues are to think about sovereignty and settler colonial issues as distinct from other kinds of race experiences. And so issues of place lend themselves to that as well. I think I'll just say a final thing about this class I'm teaching right now, Asian American literature, because it goes to the point in the symposium about these new diversities. So this isn't my field, I'm teaching the course kind of as a service course. We have a lot of new Chinese nationals, especially on campus, but also Korean nationals. And so I've been trying to get to know people and just to know what's out there. And it's been a good course to teach because the critical material surrounding this literature is that, it goes from like 1890 to the present. They really try to think about issues of race through the notion of a tension between cultural nationalism and diaspora. And so I think all of the tensions that we're trying to sort through when we do race studies are in spades made clear in this class I'm teaching right now and in the students who are in the class. Probably half of whom are either Chinese nationals. I have one Korean national, and I have a number of Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and a couple of Mexican American students. So it's just been really, and the Chinese students that speak Chinese. So that's also been an interesting feature of the class. So I think I'll just stop there without any conclusion or abrupt transition, and just leave it and we can talk about whatever you want.
I support that.
You support that? I'm supported.
Krista, I have a question about the topic of more than race. And I'm thinking about the gendering of race in particular, but not just that. In the sense that we really didn't, at least I didn't hear a lot about how we, at least from a women's studies, feminist perspective, often, the sort of what goes without saying is that we have to think these things in relation. But we really weren't thinking them in relation today. Like that really wasn't the drift of the discourse that I was hearing. So, I'd like to hear you talk about that, or maybe other people as well. And I'm thinking also about something you said, or at least the way I heard it was, we don't want to teach with a sort of agenda or a kind of plans around what sort of ways of thinking we want to give students. But I'm also thinking for myself that I do. And I'm remembering what Sam said this morning about the arc to that course, where by week, 8 or 9, they get to talk about social inequality. But he spent the whole first 9 weeks kind of unpacking and getting, like, preparing the ground to get there so that people could actually take it in a way where they were in a different place. So that says to me that social inequality as a frame for understanding race really matters, that there is a kind of truth value attached to that. And I'm thinking also of, in the last session that I was in with Lori, she gave an example of, the conflict between two students where one is saying, well, if you don't like it here, you should just leave, or in fact, all of these immigrants should just get out of here. And that her tactic would have been to really zero in, so steer into the curve, really focus on get that person to tell her story. Yeah, and when she tells the story, what's going to come out is, oh well, my dad lost his job, and my brother too, and our whole town, etc. So it's like, oh, so there's really a class issue here. So that's my question. Do we really want to leave today saying it's really just about getting the conversation, the stories going, and leaving aside or trying to leave out any sense of, well, there is a kind of truth, and maybe social inequality, or maybe a class structure, something along those lines. Structural violence is something you do want to kind of keep in the background or teach toward, not because you're going to jam it down students' throats or present it on the first day, but as a goal. And where does the gender, so the more than race fit into that? I mean, it's a huge question. A lot of us grapple with it anyway. But what's, that's the topic for you. So,
well, just at a practical level, when I was writing this, I ended up spending more time on the first part, so I didn't work on the race. And actually, place is harder to talk about, I think. I didn't talk so much about gender. I think place gets a less conceptual sort of emphasis, so I ended up doing that. I mean, where does gender fit? I don't even know how to start to answer your question, to tell you the truth. I mean, I think in the work I've done with ethics of place, for instance, gender always figures there, class always figures. They're not teasable apart. I don't have week 8 and 9 on structural oppressions or on, new forms of class. I don't know how to boil it down into that kind of, if I were to boil it down, probably my ongoing interests, which I actually feel it's hard for me to defend them. I don't feel like they're sufficient, just to be honest, since we're it's in the ethics of place. I think I care about that. And that isn't at the expense of other things, but it is a kind of perspective. I mean, it isn't at all at the expense of other things, because the other things always run through it. I don't know if that's an answer. I mean, I'm curious what other people might say. It's surprisingly hard to have that conversation right now. It's perhaps never been harder, because people everybody's deterritorialized. No one lives anywhere, and my concern isn't even environmental. I don't go quite that direction. And people I know, and I know a lot of people who do environmental studies, there's a kind of character to what those people care about. Again, in this realm of us, this kind of middle ground between a kind of more reveals personal and less argued positions. But I think I care about ethics of place. So week 8 and 9, for instance, for me might be the Rick Basso, Wisdom Sits in Places, or Mignolo, We Are What We Think, something like that, or Visner Survivance, or Anzaldúa, or Mary Austin. Like some of these texts that work, also Mary Austin, The Land of Little Rain, that work as theory. I'm not sure I'm even answering your question.
Well, I'm thinking, if I can just follow up, I'm thinking, for example, of the example that I gave of Lori's comment, that it's this kind of pedagogy of working in what surfaces. So, she didn't have this plan, but here's the student who says, I just wish they'd all get out. And then underneath that is my hometown,
Right,
and my family and jobs,
right.
and so there is place there.
Uh-huh.
So it would be an interesting sort of piece to keep in your toolkit, you know, to get students to go to place and open place up, and what's going to be in there is going to be really
All
important
kinds of
structural
stuff,
issues
yeah.
that you can then
Yeah.
sort of keep the focus on, you know, so. But what you're talking about is place, which may seem less charged than saying, oh, well, you know, it's all about gender and class here.
True. I mean, the other thing I may want to add, but I would just say, I'm teaching a text right now. I don't know if anybody knows the DJ Waldy text, Holy Land. This is a very beautiful text, and it's about LA, of course, Abigail knows it. But the thing that's interesting about it is a memoir about suburban life, and the dignity of suburban life, and the complexity of living on the grid. And the grids are many in this text. The grids have to do with the whole layout of California and water, but also the grid of the cross, of the crucifix, and his own Catholicism. Anyway, it's a very interesting text, but my point only is that in terms, I did some handouts, so you don't have to copy down all that if you want the sites on the PowerPoint. But every student in my classes considers themselves to be raised in a suburb. And yet people think suburbs are banal, and they aren't anywhere. They're like living in a mall, or living at, or eating at McDonald's every night. People don't understand them in the popular perceptions. They're not located. There's no character in them. There's nothing happening there, etc. And so it's been very interesting to try to think through the most banal of non-place places. Anyway, and it's all about class and 1,100 square foot houses, and the way in which an 1,100 square foot house is not actually a middle class house. Most middle class people live in a different suburb. This is really quite an interesting text to raise all those questions. Anyway, you can ask a question?
No, I've been kind of processing the first half of your talk, which I was interpreting as a real critique of the way universities as institutions are dealing with / not dealing with race. And then I was thinking about that extraordinary email we all got on Thursday. That totally blew my mind. Like, my brains dribbled out my ears. I was like, I can't even believe I'm reading this. And so I'm turning now back to the practical and wondering how we change university cultures to get race and all its related categories back into the conversation, maybe with the goal, if we're talking about goals, of not getting emails like that anymore. I'm putting you on the spot by saying, now what do we do? Because I don't know what we do. I mean, we're having this conference.
Well,
but
I'm tremendously...
What was the email? Could you tell us about the email?
Last year, 2 basketball players left Rice and made what seems to me to be very serious allegations about racial discrimination. And this email from the president of the university. 2 Middle Eastern men, yeah. The email that the president of the university said on Thursday was, well, as soon as these allegations came to light, we hired an independent law firm to conduct an investigation, and there was no discrimination. But we want to continue to have conversations about this. And the way I read that was, there's no discrimination, but if you think you're having discrimination, you should say something to us so we can not have a conversation about it, right? I'm still kind of floored by the content of this email and the way that it dealt with what seems to me extremely serious issues. And I think that comes into what you were saying in the first half of your talk about universities as institutions that are not dealing with it. This context is constructed around universities in which we're encouraged not to deal with these kinds of questions. Almost aggressively encouraged not to deal with them.
And just as a footnote to that, the rest of the email put the blame on the NCAA for doing the process incorrectly, where Rice did everything correct.
Yeah, there's I could say a whole bunch of other things.
Right, but just to kind of show more of the character of the letter.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. That's the only word. There are other words that I can use that aren't fit to the film. So I guess I'm just trying to open a conversation about what do we do now? How do we have conversations in public that bring us to the surface?
I can just say in American studies and in our more local context of the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, I think people are aware that certain kind of transnational trending of analyses and institutional priorities has had this effect.
Yeah.
And most of us are doing transnational analyses, and we didn't intend this as an effect. So I can't blame us for any, I mean, we're just trying to track, thank goodness people are figuring out globalization. I mean, I'm completely indebted to the sociologists and the anthropologists. That's who's figuring it out. That's who I learn everything from. You know, I think we're just figuring it out, just like we had to figure out globalization. We're always behind. That's you know, we're like the CIA. We don't, you know, we kind of arrive late, you know, and figure out what's going on. But I mean, I think David Lehman is an attorney, and he was hired for a reason. He's an attorney. He's a corporate president. We've known that. I don't think he's anti-diversity. I don't think he's anti any of that. But I think he always has a certain response to legal challenges, and what you saw was his response, because that's not the only one that we've had. But I think in terms of, like, I'm so pleased, I can't tell you, that Jennifer has figured out how to have this program for the study of race, ethnicity, and culture. And I think the trick is to make it so that it's fully conversant, for instance, with CSWGS, so that there isn't a perception that here race is happening and over here feminist theory is happening. When, I mean, one thing I'll just say right now is, like, when you look at, this came to my mind as I was thinking through it. I wasn't going to show it to you, but so I think one reason that critical race in literary study here is a little less, I don't know, developed, is that it's not completely integrated into the curriculum. Like, you have a requirement, your non-canonical requirement, right? Whereas in CSWGS, we've integrated it fully. Race studies is a feature of every single thing we do, in every part of what we consider knowledge. And so, and it's been that way for a while. And if you were to know more about the curriculum, and like the seminar and the practicum, engage research, all of that additionally makes outreach and the interface between practice and theory, makes race and poverty studies and so on into one of our principal areas of sort of focus. So anyway, my only point is that we have to figure out how to partner effectively with Jennifer so that these two institutional sites are moving so that we don't waste resources. I also think that if people identify certain things as desires or initiatives that have been fallen off the radar, the faculty can re-forward them, and that with a critical mass that at least you'll have a conversation in the university. So that's my response, Becky, to the question.
I think that we now have to mosey to 309. I'm sorry there were only 2 questions, but there was a lot of meat in there, Krista, that we could all continue to talk about.